In the early 1900s, Manhattan's Chinatown was small, just a few crowded streets tucked between the Bowery and Center Street. But what happened there would soon grip the entire city in fear. It was a war fought not by armies but by men armed with pistols, cleavers, and hatchets, fighting for control of gambling, protection, and power. Newspapers called it the Tong Wars, and its heart was a single crooked lane, Doyer Street, that would become infamous as the Bloody Angle. To understand how Chinatown reached that point, you have to look at what the neighborhood was up against. Chinese immigrants had been pouring into New York since the 1870s, fleeing poverty and exclusion in the West. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 stripped them of basic rights, denied citizenship, and left them largely outside the protection of law. Cut off from most jobs and institutions, they built their own networks of aid, benevolent associations called Tongs. At first, these were community groups that helped newcomers find housing and work. But as the neighborhood grew, the Tongs turned into something more powerful and more dangerous. Two major organizations came to dominate Chinatown: the An Liang Tong, led in New York by businessman and Tammany Hall ally Tom Lee, and the Hip Sing Tong, whose street operations were overseen by Sai Wing Mok, better known to the press as Mock Duck. What began as rivalry over gambling dens and protection money would soon erupt into one of the most violent underworld conflicts in New York's history. Chinatown's geography made it perfect for ambushes. Doyer Street, a tiny, elbow-shaped alley connecting Pell Street and Chatham Square, was a maze of barbershops, basements, and tunnels that linked buildings under the street itself. Its sharp curve created natural blind spots, so a man could be shot before he even saw his attacker. By the 1990s, police folklore would call it the most violent intersection in New York history, a nickname earned by decades of bloodshed. Even if the numbers were never officially tallied, the violence first burst into the open on August 7, 1905, during a performance at the Chinese Theater on Doyer Street. Gunmen believed to be working for the Hip Sing Tong opened fire on An Liang rivals in the audience. When the smoke cleared, 3 men were dead and several wounded. It was the first time most New Yorkers heard gunfire in Chinatown, and the first time the city realized the neighborhood's private feud had spilled into public space. The press dubbed it the Chinese Theater Massacre, and Doyer Street earned its grim new nickname, the Bloody Angle. Over the next few years, sporadic killings flared between the rival Tongs. Hatchet men, known as Bu Hao Doi, waited at corners, ducked into basements, or hid in the shadows of narrow courtyards. Many victims were gamblers or debt collectors, but ordinary residents got caught in crossfire too. Chinese shopkeepers began locking their doors at nightfall, while white New Yorkers, drawn by morbid curiosity, started coming downtown just to see the action. The papers treated Chinatown like an exotic stage set for urban violence, full of secret tunnels and shadowy killers. For the people who lived there, it was simply survival. Then, in 1909, the violence reached a horrifying peak. A young woman named Bo Kum, described by the press as a slave girl, had been trafficked from San Francisco and forced into street work. She eventually escaped and married a laundry worker in New York, seeking protection from the Hip Sing Tong. But another group claimed her as property, and in the early morning of August 15, 1909, a hatchet man broke into her room on Mott Street and murdered her. The brutality shocked even hardened detectives. Within hours, both Tongs blamed each other, and Chinatown exploded. The Bao Kum murder became front-page news. For more than a year afterward, shootings and stabbings rocked Chinatown's narrow streets. The press exaggerated numbers, but police records confirmed dozens of assaults and more than a dozen deaths between 1909 and 1911. The city called it the Second Tong War. Patrol wagons clattered down Mott and Pell every night. Detectives raided gambling dens only to find them empty minutes before. Shopkeepers hid weapons under counters. The fear spread far beyond Chinatown. New Yorkers who'd never visited the neighborhood now imagined it as a war zone. Amid the chaos, Mock Duck became a legend. He was flamboyant, superstitious, and fearless. The papers described him sitting cross-legged on the floor in gunfights, firing twin pistols while wearing a chainmail vest to stop bullets. Whether or not the image was true, it made him famous. But behind the showmanship, Mok Duck was a strategist. He understood politics. When Tom Lee's On Leong Tong used its Tammany Hall connections to shield gambling operations, Mok Duck quietly fed police tips about those same dens, using reform pressure to hurt his rivals. It was gang war by proxy, fought not only with guns, but with influence. By late 1910, even City Hall had to intervene. The Chinese consul general, local missionaries, and representatives from both Tongs met repeatedly to negotiate peace. The violence was bad for business, bad for Chinatown's reputation, and bad for New York's economy. Eventually, a fragile truce was signed. Police continued to patrol, and new gambling houses opened under mutual understanding. The gunfire faded, though smaller flare-ups continued for years. The first Tong War era, roughly 1900 to 1911, was finally over. Still, the damage lingered. Many of the same tenement buildings that hid gunmen during the wars would later become symbols of overcrowding and fire risk. Chinatown's poverty made it a target for sensational stories, and for years the words Tong War and Hatchet Man were shorthand for mystery and menace. Yet most Chinese New Yorkers weren't part of any Tong. They were laundry workers, cooks, and families simply trying to live through a time when the law wasn't on their side. The story didn't end with bloodshed. As immigration patterns changed in the 1920s and 30s, new leaders replaced the old gangsters. The Tongs rebranded themselves as legitimate business and cultural associations. Mok Duck, once the most feared man in Chinatown, was arrested in 1912 on gambling charges and served time in Sing Sing prison. When he returned, he was older, quieter, and reportedly worked to keep the peace rather than break it. By the 1930s, he had faded from the headlines, a survivor of a vanished age. Walk through Doyer Street today and it's almost impossible to imagine what it once was. The Chinese theater is long gone. The curve of the street is lined with bakeries, barbershops, and the neon sign of the historic Nam Wah Tea Parlor, which has stood there since 1920. Tourists pose for photos on the same bend once soaked in gunfire. Some of the old tunnels still exist, sealed behind basement walls or repurposed for utilities, but their legends have outlived their use. The nickname Bloody Angle survives mostly as folklore, a reminder that New York's Chinatown, like the city itself, was shaped by both violence and resilience. The same streets that saw the worst of the Tong Wars later became the heart of cultural festivals, parades, and family businesses that turned survival into success. What the city once called a war zone is now a symbol of endurance. If there's a lesson in the Chinatown Wars, it's this. When a community is cut off from protection, it learns to protect itself. And sometimes that protection turns inward into conflict. The fear that once gripped New York came from misunderstanding as much as from bullets. Chinatown wasn't lawless, it was abandoned. And when the city finally began to listen, it discovered what residents had known all along. The violence was only one chapter in a much larger story. Stand on Doyer Street now and you can feel that history in the bricks. The sharp bend still blocks your view, the same way it did for the Hatchet Men a century ago, but the sounds are different. Conversations in Mandarin and English, footsteps instead of gunfire. The ghosts are still there, but so is the life that replaced them. Because the Chinatown War didn't just leave the city in terror, it left it changed. It forced New York to see a neighborhood it had long ignored, to recognize both its suffering and its strength. The headlines faded, but Chinatown endured. The Bloody Angle became just another corner in a city built on second chances.